Well, the Saudi Arabian Public Investment Fund was started in the early 70s, really as sort of a development fund to help a few large Saudi national champions. In 2015, its charter was changed, and it's really become sort of a centerpiece and the central financial vehicle to drive forward a lot of Mohammed bin Salman, the Crown Prince's agenda, and specifically 2030 to form as the main source of financing. And essentially what they're trying to do is to take the economy off a reliance on oil production and to put a lot of the state assets into this public investment fund, so really centralizing those state assets, which had previously been either in companies or spread around other institutions, particularly the SAMA, or the Central Bank of Saudi Arabia, and put them into one pot, which is then used for an investment vehicle, partly to invest abroad, like a typical sovereign wealth fund from the region might do, but also to invest in strategic projects domestically in order to diversify the economy away from oil. So this the PIF is a central vehicle for all this, and the result is really, yes, a centralization of the money, but also a centralization of the power. And I think this is really representative of broader movements inside the Saudi government and the agenda of the Crown Prince to bring together and to consolidate a lot of that authority under one sort of development program, which in the end is his own. So the PIF, I think, is coming to play a vital role. But because of that centralization, the new diversified investment portfolio means that there's a lot of money that's suddenly chasing deals in new sectors that they're not used to investing in the past. So there are some questions about, for example, the capacity in terms of due diligence and analysis within the PIF, which, remember, was very small until just a couple of years ago, to really bring through and do the proper due diligence that's required for deals of the size that we've seen already, which means things like $2.5 billion into Uber, which means tens of billions of dollars into things like a SoftBank technology fund, into an infrastructure fund. So a whole range of areas that the initial capacity or staff of the PIF, which, remember, was only about 50 people until a couple of years ago, would be underwhelmed they would be overwhelmed by the project. That's not to mention also upcoming investment sort of ambitions of the PIF. They're looking to expand to about $400 billion of assets by 2020. That's a lot of money. They're already at 230, but that's a lot of extra money in just a couple of years. So we're going to have to see whether the institution has the legs to carry forward that kind of ambition. So the Saudi-Russian relationship when it comes to oil prices, which is what the Crown Prince was referring to this week, is a really interesting one. Since a couple of years, they've organized an OPEC, non-OPEC production deal in order to prop up oil prices, particularly in the face of falling oil prices after 2014, which came to a low in 2016, hitting about $27. And that's really what was the driving force, was to raise the price up from that kind of bottom. It's been relatively successful in that it is widely credited with maintaining the sort of buoyancy in the market and keeping it in sort of a $55 to $65 range. Now, it has lasted for 2 years, which I think is quite remarkable given the shifting interests among oil producers. Usually those kind of deals are really sort of a month-to-month, if not year-to-year affair, and they have indeed extended it to 2018 and are likely to extend it this week into 2019. What Mohammed bin Salman is proposing with the Russians is, he's mentioned this week, a 10 or even 20-year kind of scope for a long-term production deal. That makes sense, certainly, from at least to say, from the Saudi perspective. Now, Saudi Arabia has much more interest in maintaining this deal, particularly over the short term. Why? Because they're looking to engage in an initial public offering of Saudi Aramco. The date was supposed to be 2018. It's probably going to be pushed into early 2019. But critically, the valuation of the company is going to be based at least partly on the oil price. So in order for them to gain at least not a quick win, but a good sort of public sign of their project, they want a high valuation. The Crown Prince has mentioned $2 trillion for the entire company. That's probably overblown. It's more around 1.3. But in any case, they're going to want that number to be as high as possible. So they have an incentive to keep that deal going, at least until this IPO. From the Russian side, it's a little bit less clear. So, you know, I think the statement that the Crown Prince put out today is interesting as a signal towards the Russians, and as a signal of his ambitions of maintaining a longer-term deal. But from the Russian side, yeah, it's not as evident, and I think what they're going to be doing is continuing to look from a year-to-year basis. If this long-term deal something materializes, it's much more likely to be sort of a framework solution where on a shorter term basis the details are really negotiated. And at the point that it doesn't make much sense anymore for the Russians, I think we have to be ready for them to disengage from this relationship. On the other hand, once the IPO is through, who knows how committed the Saudis are actually going to be to this, because we have to remember that the longer term game about this is that as they maintain higher oil prices, American shale oil production will rise to fill that gap. So they need to play a balancing act and find a sweet spot where their budgets get balanced. In the Saudi case, that's about $70 a barrel. But on the other hand, where they don't encourage so much American production that the price gets driven back down, and in fact they end up losing market share, so they end up with the same price with much less market share. Well, I think the Saudi Aramco IPO, which is something that I was near to when I was working at Saudi Aramco just a couple of years ago, in the beginning stages of the IPO process, I think is something that is, there's enough political commitment and political interest to go forward with it. So I think the kind of idea that perhaps it doesn't go forward at all is probably not the case. And in fact, I think that there is a sufficient kind of political impetus these days in Saudi Arabia in the context of this transformation that's being undertaken by the Crown Prince to really hit timetables. And so that's the kind of pressure that ministers and other subordinates in the government are under right now in the entire transformation process. And Saudi Aramco is definitely under that same kind of time pressure. So I think from it on a day-to-day basis, the kind of signals that you'll get from the company will be precisely as the one that Amin Nasser has given. We're on schedule, 2018 is still viable. The reality is probably a bit different, and I think from the kind of statements that we've seen just over the past 2 weeks from Saudi officials, starting to see a little bit of reticence from Khalid al-Faleh and some others, and a likelihood that we're going to get pushed into 2019. And that has to do with the reality, even inside Saudi Aramco, of doing the kind of due diligence and doing the kind of preparations that's necessary to undertake an IPO of this magnitude. So we have to remember that even 5% of the company is more than double the largest IPO in history, which is Alibaba out of China. So I think that we're likely to see a delay into 2019. I think that it's certainly going to go ahead. In terms of valuation, I mentioned that the Crown Prince had mentioned $2 trillion, and that was already a year and a half, 2 years ago. The expectations are that it will be quite a bit lower. Current valuations, given a $65 price, tend to be in the order of $1.2 to $1.4 trillion for the entire company. But a lot could happen in the meantime. And at the end of the day, I think the IPO and the valuation of the IPO is a signal about what the market believes is the viability of the overall transformation project. Because in many ways, I would say that Vision 2030, it's all a bit of a house of cards. I mean, it falls together or it stands together. So if they can get the kind of liquidity that they need to pump into the PIF from the Saudi Aramco sale, if the investments and the management of the PIF seems professional and valuable and really bears fruit, and if finally the welfare of the Saudi population, I mean, the Saudi population feels themselves the benefits that are coming out of this essentially very large bet on a transition process, then I think we'll see a huge success. But I would just caution that, you know, centralizing power in order to drive through big reforms absent very much headwind or domestic resistance is great in terms of getting things done. But that kind of institutional shift of centralizing power, putting it all in one direction and putting it all towards one aim also has big risks. And so if the oil price is such, if the valuation is such, is too low, if indeed the PIF turns out to be a less than capable vehicle, particularly on the domestic strategic investment side, things could go wrong. So I think we need to be optimistic, but certainly keep aware of the warning signs as we go down the road about whether all of those things are actually functioning properly.